and the exposure of the sinister Codex Alimentarius puts them at odds with the establishment who prefer the allopathic closed-shop approach. Undeterred, Paul continues valuable research into keeping people well via the natural approach. He has also co-authored a book entitled The Nazi Roots of the Brussels EU, sealing his position as a major irritant to power-hungry, corrupt, overpaid bureaucrats and proponents of centralised power. Paul has previously enjoyed great success within the music industry prior to becoming Executive Director of the Rath Foundation and has worked with many influential musicians. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Anthony Taylor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
The Dr. Rath Health Foundation, I will start with that first. It's a non-profit organisation. Our European head office is based in the Netherlands, in the south of the Netherlands, in the area of Limburg. We also have some smaller offices in some of the European capitals, and we run a research institute in California, in sunny Santa Clara. And in no small part, the things I'll be talking about tonight relate to the work and the discoveries of this research institute. So yeah, the title of my talk, I always feel I'm not very good at doing titles really, because I always find it very hard to sum up what I'm going to talk about in one sentence. It's the most difficult thing in the world, I find. So I cheated and I did a subtitle as well, and I'll try and explain what it's all about. The breakthrough scientific discoveries and natural health part is the easy part. That relates to the work of Dr. Rath, our founder. He's a German physician and scientist, and the work of our researchers in California. The emerging paradigms part relates to the fact that based upon this research, we think we can chart a course towards what we think the future practice of medicine will look like and the types of approaches that will become the norm in the world of the future, hopefully the world of the not too distant future. The exposing of hidden histories part relates to several things. It relates to the reasons why you haven't heard about the things I'm going to be talking about tonight before. It relates also to actual history, particularly the history of Europe and this thing we call the EU. Because the EU and the history of Europe very, very much have denied us the truth about how the current practice of medicine, and indeed how the EU itself came to be. So in a way, my talk tonight covers three areas. It covers health, it covers politics, and it covers history. But in all of those areas, I promise you that I'll be telling you things that we have been denied by our so-called rulers, and things that literally have the potential to save millions of lives. So let's go. First of all, a few words about our research institute. As I said, it's based in California, in Santa Clara. It was founded by Dr. Rath over here, and it's headed by Dr. Alexander Niedzwiecki, a Polish scientist. And what they specialise in doing at our institute, they specialise in conducting research using natural micronutrients. That means vitamins, minerals, amino acids and other trace elements, the stuff that we find in our food. And the findings of Dr. Rath and our team have been published in many, many prestigious science and medical journals. In fact, they've had now over 100 what are called peer-reviewed scientific studies published in such journals. And that's a lot. So far as we know, there is no independently funded scientific research institute specialising in this area in the world that have had so many studies published in this area. And based on their work, Dr. Rath's discoveries and the research of our researchers, we believe that the stage is now set for chronic diseases to become a thing of the past. as I'll describe tonight, this will not just happen by itself. It's not going to just happen, as a natural result of these discoveries being made. It depends in part upon meetings like this tonight, where I share stuff with you, and then you go away and tell others about it. You know, before I started tonight, I had a walk down the side wall there, and I looked at some of the DVDs and things that you have there tonight. So I realised that you guys are pretty clued up about the fact that we've been misled in this increasingly complicated world of ours. And the fact that if I had one message to convey to you tonight is that we've been misled about health. We've been misled about politics, the way politics is conducted and the way the European Union has been set up. And we've been misled about history. We've been denied the true history of, in particular, the two world wars that were conducted in the 20th century. There are three breakthrough discoveries that Dr. Arth and our researchers have made. They've made a number of key discoveries, but there are three that I think stand out more than any other in pointing to the fact that there are other natural, safe, effective approaches to controlling the biggest diseases of the industrialised world, and indeed the entire world today. The first one is the fact that atherosclerosis, or heart disease as we call it, is actually an early form of what used to be called the sailor's disease, scurvy. Scurvy is clinical vitamin C deficiency, and hundreds of years ago, over 1 million sailors are estimated to have lost their lives as a direct result of the fact that we didn't know at that time that there was a substance in food, vitamin C, an essential substance in food, which, if it wasn't included as a part of the daily diet, resulted in death, and a particularly horrible death at that. The man who conducted the research that proved that some foods prevent scurvy was this man, James Lind, who was a surgeon in the British Royal Navy. And he conducted actually a pretty good scientific experiment on board one of his ships. He took 12 sailors, okay, and he divided them into 6 groups. And each group was given a different treatment for the scurvy. One poor unfortunate couple of guys were given seawater to drink, because some people thought that seawater would cure scurvy, and of course it didn't, they died. Others were given, 2 guys were actually given cider to drink, because there was some evidence that they thought cider might help. And in actual fact, cider did help a little bit, because actually cider contains, or cider coming from apples, contains a little bit of vitamin C. So the guys who got the cider improved a bit. But the 2 guys who actually were cured were the guys who got lots and lots and lots of limes and lemons and lime and lemon juice to eat and drink. And they recovered. So Lind proved something, but it still took, a long, long time, 50 years or more, for the British Navy to actually accept that actually limes and lemons, citrus fruits, prevented scurvy. Which actually that tells us something, doesn't it? Because sometimes, even when somebody has a really good idea, and even when he proves beyond all reasonable doubt that he's right and that it works, authorities, governments, can take an awful long time to accept it. Galileo, if you know anything about Galileo, discovering and working out that the Earth was not the centre of the universe. The sun didn't revolve around the Earth, even though evidence, appeared at first to indicate that it did. Galileo said, no, the sun is the centre of our sort of solar system, and we all revolve around that. And the mathematicians at the time took to increasingly bizarre mathematical equations to prove that Galileo was wrong, and he was, named a heretic, as I'm sure you know that story. So just because somebody is widely assumed to be wrong, we know that in actual fact the evidence is what actually counts. The evidence and the proof is what matters. Number 2. Breakthrough discovery number 2 is related to number 1 in that it's that micronutrient deficiency. We're talking about deficiencies of vitamins and minerals and things. This is the primary underlying cause for most cardiovascular conditions today. This includes high blood pressure, heart failure, irregular heartbeat, and also the types of circulatory conditions that occur in diabetes. All of these have at their root micronutrient deficiencies. I'll be explaining more later about how it comes that micronutrient deficiencies are so common today. But for now, just remember this simple fact. Number 3 is always the one that people find quite shocking and surprising. This is the one that people say, well, surely, if this was true, I'd have been told about this before. And it's this, it's that the spread of all cancer cells, and I put the word all in capital letters because that's what our scientists are saying. This is what the results of their published research is indicating. The spread of all cancer cells can be inhibited naturally. It's a pretty big statement. And I wouldn't be saying it were it not for the fact that our scientists in California and Dr. Arthur are convinced of this. All of their work points towards this. And I'll be talking a lot more about this as we move on. To understand what I've said so far, to understand why micronutrients play such a key role in preventing and controlling chronic diseases, I have to introduce you to something that our scientists call the foundations of cellular medicine. Cellular medicine is, if you like, the new medicine. And this is the approach that we believe will become, in time, the standard approach to dealing with these conditions. And if you can understand this, it's only a few slides, but if you can understand this, you're a long way forward towards understanding how to deal with the health problems that occur to all of us as we get older and go through life and age. The basic principle of cellular medicine is that diseases originate at the cellular level. You see, right now, at the moment, if we have, a health problem that's serious enough, our doctors send us to the hospital. And we have now a system of medicine that has entire departments built up to the treatment of individual organs. You know, if you have a heart problem, you're sent to the cardiologist. If you have a liver problem, you're sent to the guy in the hepatology department. If it's a neurologically based problem, you're sent to the neurologist, and so on. And this is the sort of medicine that we've been encouraged to believe is the modern scientific approach. This, we are so lucky, we are told, to be living in this age. But whether we stay healthy or whether we fall sick is not decided at the level of the organs. It's decided at the level of the billions of cells that make up our bodies. Healthy cells make healthy organs, make healthy bodies. Sick cells, the cells that have been starved over a period of time long enough to cause problems in those cells, result in problematic organs, organs that make you sick, and sometimes can even cost you your lives. So, diseases originate at the cellular level. When we eat food, we're not so much feeding the organs, we're feeding the cells that make up those organs. And at the basic level, the functioning of our cells is something that even a child can understand the basics of. In fact, we've used this with children for that very reason. I've taught this to my children, in fact. My boys are teenagers now. The 4 key components in all of the cells of the body. There's the cell nucleus, which is this sort of purplish blob here. And you can compare the functions of a cell to the functions of a small city. And the nucleus is like the city hall because it contains all of the information, the genetic information in this case, that's necessary for the running of the cell. The cell membrane, which is like the wall of the cell that protects it from the outside environment. This is like the city wall, if you like. The city wall that protects, in the olden times, the city from the invaders and outside pathogens, in the case of the cells outside of it. Then we have the Golgi complex. This is like the city factory because it processes the larger molecules, the fats and the proteins in the cell. And finally, we have something particularly important. So these are the mitochondria. And these are like the power stations, the power plants of the cells. Because you see, cellular energy is vital for life. if our cells stop producing cellular energy, we die. In order for life to exist, our cells must keep on producing cellular energy. And this is the point of this. The reason I'm telling you this is that micronutrients are essential biological fuel for our cells. They are in fact the cofactors that enable the fires within our cells to keep burning. A chronic deficiency of micronutrients is the key cause of poor cellular function, and as a result, the key cause of chronic diseases that are afflicting mankind so desperately right now for lack of the right answer, for lack of the right approach in treating them. If you've understood so far these really basic principles, let's take a look now at how they apply to cardiovascular disease, to heart disease. The first thing we have to do, if we're trying to understand heart disease, is to look at the cholesterol issue, because this Goliath of medicine that we've been encouraged to place our trust and indeed our lives in has been telling us for some time now that the cause of heart disease is cholesterol. Cholesterol is like the big bad enemy that if we're not reducing it to its lowest amount in the body, it will kill us. But in actual fact, cholesterol, how many of you knew this? Cholesterol is actually an essential substance in the body. If you knew that, good. Put your hand, hey. An educated group of people is the best sort of people to talk to and with. So yeah, cholesterol is a molecule that's essential for life. In fact, vitamin D, we all know, I guess, that sunshine produces vitamin D in the bodies, but actually it's the action of sunshine on the cholesterol deposits beneath our skin. Vitamin D is actually produced from cholesterol. So it follows that if you haven't got a sufficient amount of cholesterol in your body, you're not sufficiently able to produce optimum amounts of vitamin D in our bodies. So cholesterol is not the enemy, and therefore it follows that statin drugs are not the answer to heart disease. And while we're on, I apologise for the gory nature of this picture, but this is what heart bypass surgery actually looks like. This is not the answer to heart disease either. I mean, this is where the surgeon opens up your leg, takes veins out of your lower leg, and stitches them around the blockages in your arteries to resupply blood to your heart. I mean, it's gruesome, gory stuff. And as I always say, you really, really, really do not want this to happen to you. And if anything I say tonight enables one person to avoid this outcome, my time here tonight would have been worth it. The thing is, research now suggests that coronary bypass surgery may cause measurable brain damage in at least half of people who undergo it. So, as I say, we really want to avoid this as an outcome. And if there's another possible way to control cardiovascular disease, we have to consider it. So the truth about cholesterol and heart disease. Well, get this, high cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease, it's the consequence of it. What do I mean by that? You have to imagine and understand and remember that the heart is the hardest working muscle in the body. The heart is a muscle, okay? And it has to beat every second, every minute, every hour, every day of our lives in order to keep us alive. And with every heartbeat, the force of blood that's ejected from the chambers of the heart through the arteries is truly enormous. It's really forceful. And in fact, with every heartbeat, the arteries of the heart are practically flattened with each heartbeat. Now, understand also that every day of our lives, our bodies are in a constant state of repair. And the repairs that are affected in the body result from the body having a sufficient supply, hopefully, of micronutrients, vitamins and minerals and things. One of the key molecules in the body is collagen. Collagen is like the connective glue that holds all of our tissues together. And the production of collagen to an enormous degree depends upon an adequate level of vitamin C. In scurvy, remember I started out talking about scurvy, the end result of scurvy is massive hemorrhaging in the body. And the reason that is because the body is literally falling apart. The tissues of the body no longer have sufficient amounts of collagen to hold them together. The damage that occurs, the minute microscopic cracks and damage that occur as a result of a beating heart can be repaired. They are repaired. The body wants to repair them, and it uses collagen to do that. Collagen is the key corrective repair molecule that the body uses. And in the case of the arteries, it's no different. But, and this is the key thing, in the absence of sufficient amounts of collagen, in the absence of sufficient amounts of vitamin C and other nutrients involved in this process, lysine and proline, the body uses cholesterol to patch up the minute pieces of damage in the arteries. Cholesterol is like a secondary repair mechanism in the body. The body's a miracle. The fact that it has these secondary repair mechanisms, it's incredible. And cholesterol works pretty well at first. But, obviously, if the damage continues, if these lesions and microscopic cracks continue to occur and they're not repaired, if the body isn't resupplied with sufficient amounts of vitamin C, this patching up process with cholesterol eventually results in the narrowing of the diameter of the arteries, with a consequent risk of heart attack and stroke. So this is why we say that high cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease, it's the consequence. If you've understood so far, this also answers something else. Because our doctors and the medical profession tell us about the dangers, the risks of heart disease. But why do we not get nose attacks and ear attacks? Why is it just heart attacks? Why is it that the cholesterol is laid down primarily only in the major arteries? There's no such thing as venosclerosis, arteriosclerosis being the narrowing of the arteries, cholesterol deposits in the arteries. There's no such thing, there's no such problem to all intents and purposes in the veins. The veins, and the reason for that is that the pressure, the force of blood flow through these minor blood vessels is much, much lower than in the arteries coming from the heart. The force of blood flow from the heart causes this damage, but the damage is much less in these organs, you see. So that's why we don't get ear attacks, or nose attacks, or things, or finger attacks. I mean, you can test this if you were able to do it for long enough. If you put your Wellington boot on your garden hose as the water was flowing through it, and remember how I said that the arteries are essentially almost flattened with each heartbeat. If you stepped on your garden hose for long enough, for days, maybe weeks on end, your hose would eventually spring a leak. Your heart arteries, the body's different. The body can repair itself so long as it has the proper tools to do the job. But there's something else really interesting, because most doctors don't realise that in the animal kingdom, heart attacks are essentially pretty rare. They essentially don't occur. And the reason for that is that man and the apes, guinea pigs, and I think there's a fruit-eating species of bat and bird, we're the only animal species that do not produce our own vitamin C in our bodies. How many of you knew that? One or two less hands there, a few, but okay. Yeah, you see, practically every animal on the planet produces its own vitamin C in its liver. If any of you are doctors or of a scientific bent, the production of vitamin C is a 4-stage enzymatic process. This is about as much as I get in deep science here. And man, and the guinea pigs and the apes, we lack the 4th enzyme. We lack an enzyme called L-gluconolactone oxidase. That's the end of the big science lesson. So, this is why animals don't suffer from heart attacks like we do, because they're able to better affect the repairs to their arteries, you see. And a large animal that's the approximate weight of a human being produces thousands of milligrams of vitamin C in its body every day. And it's produced from glucose, in fact, in case you're wondering where it's produced from. The recommended daily amount from governments around the world is generally between 60 and 90 milligrams, which you can sort of see how far we are behind these animals in having enough to prevent heart disease. And guess this, also when animals get sick, they produce more vitamin C in their bodies. So the things that Linus Pauling was saying and the things Dr. Rath is saying are reflected in the animal kingdom. This is what animals do, naturally. It's what their bodies were designed to do. So we don't get enough vitamin C and other micronutrients in our bodies. This is clear, and I'll explain more why about this a little bit later on. So, preventing atherosclerosis involves having an optimum supply of micronutrients to repair vitamin deficiencies in the walls of the arteries. Deficiencies occur through the damage, through the force of blood being ejected from the heart with every heartbeat. Replenishing the vitamins to the arteries of your heart helps to prevent and repair them, helps to prevent damage and repair damage. And in doing this helps to prevent heart disease and stroke. Why haven't our doctors been told this? This is, it's not even complicated. Our researchers have published many studies confirming this. Why haven't we been told? We'll get into this in a little while. And we know from enlightened doctors around the world that this works, this approach works. Here we have a patient whose coronary artery plaques were successfully removed using these very approaches I'm describing to you now. This is a CT scan showing the before and after in this patient's artery. We have a book online. You can read it for free on this website here. It's called Why Animals Don't Get Heart Attacks, But People Do. My colleague over here, Michelle, has a few copies with her. She'd be happy to give you one if you want. They're not expensive, but this is life-saving information, which is why we put it also for free online. We believe that life-saving information should not be simply something that is only available to people if they pay money for it. In fact, this reflects to us everything that is wrong about the current approach to healthcare. Our goal, essentially, the goal of Dr. Art and our foundation, is to change the practice of medicine. That's what it's about. If we have to get to where we want to be, this is what has to happen. At the moment, to a large part, we have to become our own doctors. We have to learn how better to look after our bodies. But until then, until our doctors become sufficiently educated, we have to look after ourselves. This guy, this is an interesting guy. This is Albert Sven-Georgi. He was the guy who discovered vitamin C. In fact, he won the 1937 Nobel Prize for Medicine for his discovery in the isolation of vitamin C. He conducted the first research work using it. And the interesting thing is that right from the start, he believed that the medical profession had misled the public about his discovery. Now, remember, we're talking about 1937, so it's a pretty long while ago. But in 1970, he wrote a very interesting letter to another Nobel Prize winner, Dr. Linus Pauling. In fact, this is where Dr. Rath started out the major part of his research career, working with Linus. Linus Pauling was a very clever guy. He won 2 Nobel Prizes, in fact. Well, listen to what Sven-Georgi said to Linus Pauling. He said, right from the beginning, I felt that the medical profession misled the public. If you don't take ascorbic acid, that's vitamin C, with your food, you get scurvy. So the medical profession said that if you don't get scurvy, you're all right. He said, I think that this is a very grave error. He went on, he said, scurvy is not the first sign of the deficiency, but a pre-mortal syndrome, meaning the beginning of something that can kill you. And for full health, you need much more, very much more. I am taking myself about 1 gram, that's 1,000 milligrams a day. He said, this does not mean that this is really the optimum dose, because we do not know what full health really means and how much ascorbic acid, that's vitamin C, you need for it. He finished, he said, what I can tell you is that one can take any amount of ascorbic acid without the least danger. I mean, it's a pretty different message, isn't it, to the message that our doctors and the medical profession and the media are giving us today. That last sentence. One can take any amount of ascorbic acid without the least danger. I mean, I would qualify that with the fact that there will be probably an amount if you're reckless enough and take bucket loads of the stuff, every hour, every day, you probably would kill yourself. I mean, I think there's, most things probably have a tolerable toxic dose. In the end, if you exceed it, it will kill you. But, he was talking about the sorts of doses that doctors today still are using therapeutically. And either he was wrong, okay, and he shouldn't have won a Nobel Prize, or he was telling us something that's been forgotten, that's been ignored. Okay, having come thus far, let's now take a little look at how these same principles apply to cancer. Because with the possible exception, I guess, of HIV/AIDS, cancer is the disease that most of us have been brought up to fear the most. A diagnosis of cancer is usually followed, I guess, in the mind of the patient by, my God, I'm going to die, or some other sort of thought. This is the way we've been encouraged to believe. And these ideas keep us under the control of not just the medical profession, who have largely been misled themselves to a great extent, but also the drug industry, who's at the root of all this. We know from the media and our doctors that there are many different types of cancer. And in this respect, they're all correct, there are. And cancer can take a variety of different forms and courses. But there is one key thing that all types of cancer cells have in common. And it's that they all produce, regardless of the type of cancer we're talking about, they all produce what we call biological cutting tools. And these are enzymes that destroy or eat through collagen. All cancer cells that our researchers have tested produce enzymes that eat through collagen. And they do this in order to spread. This very mechanism, this idea that enzymes produced by cancer cells can eat through collagen, is precisely how all cancer cells spread. Because you see, in cancer, it's not usually the original tumour that kills a patient, but it's the metastasis, the process of cancer spreading to other organs, more distant parts of the body. And get this, the more of these enzymes, these biological cutting tools that destroy collagen, the more of these enzymes that any cancer produces, the more malignant the cancer will be, and the shorter the patient's lifespan. How cancer spreads? I mean, I've pretty much told you, but here it is in sort of graphical form. A cancer cell in an organ produces collagen-digesting enzymes, and it almost literally eats its way through to the bloodstream. Once it's in the bloodstream, it can travel down, of course, to more distant parts of the body. And they exit the body using this entirely same process, producing collagen-digesting enzymes that eat their way through the blood vessel walls and lodge themselves in another organ. The inevitable result being metastasis in other organs. Well, the good thing here, the interesting thing here, the key discovery here is that micronutrients, there are specific groups of micronutrients that can naturally block this process. Partly it depends upon strengthening your collagen. Remember I told you that collagen is the key molecule that strengthens the tissues of our body and holds them together. If your collagen is strong enough, you are obviously going to make it harder for cancer cells to eat their way through to reach the bloodstream. Vitamin C, the amino acids lysine and proline, and some of the polyphenols found in green tea have these properties. And they work even better when they're combined together in what we call a synergistic combination. And our researchers and Dr. Rath have now published more than 50 studies in peer-reviewed science and medical journals. That means journals that, before the study is published, are examined by other scientists to look for possible flaws in the carrying out of the study and the arguments. 50 studies documenting that this approach is effective in preventing the spread of cancer. And what they've found, that this combination, this approach, is effective against all human cancer cells known. We know from enlightened doctors around the world that this works. This was a lady who had a brain tumour. You can see it here. This was an MRI scan. And this is the before and this is the after. And in slightly just under a year was the difference between these two MRI scans. And you can see that the tumour had vanished. So we know this works. This was a guy who had a tumour on his lung. His physician used this approach, and his lung cancer was successfully treated using it. We have a book all about this. I mean, what I'm giving you here now is just a very brief summary, a little picture of the discoveries and the work that's taking place. This book, again, you can read it for free online. Michelle has some copies as well. But again, life-saving information for cancer should not depend upon whether people can afford to purchase it or not. You know, so this is the website. It's there. You can read it for free. We didn't just start sharing this information. These discoveries in the area of cancer are not just something that our people discovered last week or anything. In fact, the dissemination of this information began over 12 years ago. In 2002, our research team gave a presentation at a breast cancer conference in Miami. But Dr. Arth and our researchers, even by then, were already concerned that the medical profession would not share this widely and quickly enough to save lives. So what they did, they published a full-page advert in the largest newspaper in the United States, which is the USA Today newspaper. And it reached a lot of people. It garnered a lot of interest, but it didn't change the world. But this is always our philosophy, is that groundbreaking medical discoveries not just deserve, ought to be shared with the public. Once they reach the point where the evidence is strong that they are useful and helpful in patients, this is the time when doctors need to be taught about them. Not much happened for 3 years after this announcement, but just over 3 years later, something very interesting happened. You see, the largest research institute in the world is the US government-funded National Institutes of Health. And they have a very prestigious scientific journal known as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's the official journal, in fact, of the US National Academy of Sciences. And in September 2005, they published this scientific paper. This is the first page of it. And this paper stated unequivocally that vitamin C selectively kills cancer cells. What that means is that vitamin C kills cancer cells, but it leaves healthy cells unharmed. Well, of course it would, wouldn't it? Because vitamin C is meant to be in our bodies. Remember what Albert Szent-Györgyi said, you know, there's no level at which you could find that it is harmful. But of course, our body needs vitamin C, so why would it harm healthy cells? But vitamin C is lethal. In large enough amounts in the body, it is lethal to cancer cells. And this is what this paper confirmed. So the US government knows about this. In fact, on a small scale, people from the National Institutes of Health have been conducting studies in cancer patients with intravenous vitamin C, which is really a great way to build up a really high level of vitamin C in the body. So there is some good work being done in this area, but we're still some way before this will become the mainstream approach to treating cancer and controlling it. One of the key questions that always comes up whenever we talk about this, our foundation, is that, well, yeah, this is all fine, but can't we get all the vitamins we need in our food? I suspect you've probably had one or two people coming here talking to you about this. It's actually probably a lecture in itself, I guess. I'm only going to give a small handful of slides here, giving one or two different perspectives on this question. This is the part that most people know about. There's been independent studies conducted in a number of countries now, the US, Canada, the Netherlands, and also here in the UK and other countries, to show that the nutrient content of our food has fallen significantly and measurably over the last 50, 60 years or so. Some evidence even suggests, in fact, that even as early as the 1930s, this problem had already existed for several generations. These tables were from the research conducted in Canada, and they show the fall in the nutrient content of broccoli and potatoes between 1951 and 1999 in Canada. Broccoli, between 1951 and 1999, it had fallen by almost 63%, the level of broccoli. The level of iron, almost 34% down. Vitamin A, almost 56% down. I mean, these are pretty big falls. Thiamine, that's vitamin B1, down 40%. Riboflavin, that's vitamin B2, that's down almost 43%. Potatoes, on the bottom here. Calcium, over the same almost 50-year period, down 27%. Iron, down over 57%. Vitamin A, down 100%. They couldn't find any. And again, you know, riboflavin down 50%, niacin, that's vitamin B3, down 45%. And the same sort of research has been conducted in, as I say, a number of countries now. So we think this is pretty real. I mean, the key question is why our governments aren't acting on it, and in some cases they're actually denying it that it's actually the case. But there's more, you see, to this. There's more to this, because as I always say, I'm a pretty simple man, really. I'm quite old-fashioned, and in our household, my wife, I should be ashamed to say, my wife does the shopping. My wife is the person who spends most of the time in the supermarket. But when I do go to the supermarket, the part that I always find most interesting is actually looking in people's trolleys to see what they eat. Because in large part, I feel that, for the most part, this is not scientific, this is just personal observation, okay? The contents of people's trolleys usually give you an indication as to their state of health, you know. It's very, very rare that you see people looking bright-eyed and sort of, you know, full of colour and brimming with health, eating a lot of junk and rubbish, you know. And conversely, the opposite is also true. You don't usually see people who are looking really, really poorly and, you know, filling their trolleys full of vegetables and stuff, you know. It doesn't happen. So, in a sense, I mean, this is the bad news, really. In part, we have ourselves to blame, because the diets that, you know, mankind are eating now are vastly different to the diet that we were brought up on, you know, thousands of generations ago. These additives and things, and, you know, GM seeds and all the rest, they didn't exist. It's not what we're meant to be eating, crisps and stuff, you know. That's the final preachy part of my talk tonight. But this is interesting. One of the biggest secrets in the drug industry today is that all pharmaceuticals deplete the body of micronutrients. This is one of the biggest secrets that they don't want you to know. And here's the proof. If you want to go somewhere, there's a medical textbook written that has all this information in it. It's called the Drug-Induced Nutrient Depletion Handbook. And it was published about 15 years ago. And it cites 459 published studies on this subject. And it identifies around 150 different classes, you know, groups, types of drugs that cause nutrient depletion. That means that the doctor gives you drugs, and whilst the drug might help to control the symptoms, it's actually depleting your body of micronutrients. So, I mean, essentially it's this, right? This is, if you're asking now, why are people deficient in vitamins and other micronutrients, the simple answer is our food supply no longer contains the same levels of vitamins and minerals that it once did. People are no longer eating a natural diet, and that type of natural diets, the processed foods and things, fast foods. People are eating vastly different things that are nutrient, they're no longer nutrient-dense foods. They are foods that contain only sparse amounts of micronutrients. And then when they get sick, they go to their doctors, and their doctor gives them drugs that, whilst they cover up symptoms, they further deplete the body of micronutrients, hence causing more problems and side effects, requiring more drugs to treat them, and so on. And the process is just, this is what's happening. And your doctor, I guarantee you, You know, ask your doctor about this book, and I would guarantee you that the vast majority of doctors are not even aware of this. Because they're not being told about it, they're not being taught it. They don't know, it's not their own fault, they don't know anything else. Okay, so the first part of my talk tonight has been obviously about the health part. And I think you guys are probably a little bit different to most in that you are very, very well aware that so many of the things that we are being told about in this world of ours today are actually not true, that we are being misled. Well, the reasons why you wouldn't have heard this before, or why people haven't understood this before, is because we've been misled about the nature of the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, the news at the moment, you know, here in Britain, is all about whether Pfizer will buy AstraZeneca, you know, and what will be the effect upon our economy and everything. Well, actually, the effect upon the economy is everything that this is about. Because, you see, diseases are exploited by drug companies as markets. You know, when you get sick, you are a more valuable commodity to a drug company than you are when you're healthy. Drug companies are not really interested in you being healthy. There's no money, get this, there's no money in curing diseases. The real money in the drug industry is in giving people a pill they have to take day after day, week after week for the rest of their lives. That's how the drug industry makes money. There's no money in cures. And you think about the trillions of dollars that have been spent on research, you know, none of them are seeking a cure. They're seeking ways to control diseases, to keep customers. The human body is like a marketplace. The drug industry defines the human body as a marketplace and a potential source of profits. And what it wants is a monopoly on the practice of medicine. Natural approaches that cannot be patented, are no use to it. If you invent a synthetic chemical, a molecule that doesn't exist in nature, and you produce it as a drug, and especially if you're the first company to produce a drug for a specific disease, you essentially, for the period of time that that patent is in effect, you own that disease. You control that market. Albert Szent-Györgyi discovered vitamin C, but he couldn't patent it. He couldn't say he invented it. He just discovered it. Vitamin C exists in nature. Nobody invented it. It exists in nature. So the drug industry, in order to survive, has to eliminate any and all competition from natural, non-patentable therapies. And I know you've had people coming to you here talking about codex. Well, that's the reason why. It's the patent issue. The patency issue is the thing that's holding the pharma industry together. If ever anything happened to change that, if ever non-patentable molecules like vitamins were allowed to compete on an equal footing, the drug industry would be halfway towards being finished, especially if the information about natural alternative approaches was sufficiently widely available. It's not even, right? It's not even as if our government, the British government, doesn't know about the nature of the drug industry. It does. And in fact, about 10 years ago, the House of Commons Health Committee produced this report. And look at the title, The Influence of the Pharmaceutical Industry. This is a 126-page report. On the day that it was produced, it was news. It was covered. The day after, it was gone. It was buried. No more was heard about it. But when you read it, it makes fascinating reading. It confirms much of what I've been saying. It describes the influence of the drug industry as pervasive and persistent. It talks about drug safety concerns. It acknowledges that drug-induced illness is an increasing problem. That's diseases, health problems caused by drugs, needing more drugs to treat them, and so on. And it actually states there's not enough independent research being conducted to compare drug approaches with non-drug approaches. And in fact, some of the witnesses who took part in the inquiry stated openly that there's little commercial interest in non-drug approaches. The government understands the way the drug industry works. There'll be copies of this, if there's any MPs watching this film on YouTube, there'll be copies of this report in the House of Commons library, okay? Why has nothing been done about this? You know, a lot of time and money has been spent producing a report, but there's been, that I can see, there's next to little or no action been taken about it. And, you know, the power of the drug industry. I mean, the drug industry is a $1 trillion a year industry. Its total global sales in drugs amount to $1 trillion a year. By 2017, total drug sales are expected to be worth $1.2 trillion. That's $1,200 billion. Okay? I mean, compare that, you know, to put that in perspective, the GDP of Great Britain is, you know, £1.5 trillion, you know, this is dollars. But it's a huge, if the drug industry was a country, this will put it in perspective, if the drug industry was a country and the figure of $1 trillion was its GDP, it would be about the 15th or 16th richest country in the world. So this is what it's about. But this also raises another question, doesn't it? Because if the drug industry is a $1 trillion a year industry, why does it need our money? Why do we have to give generously to medical charities collecting money for drug research? I mean, it's insane, isn't it? It's absolutely insane. And yet, good-hearted, honest people who give to such charities and work for such charities believe that they're doing the right thing. I'm not criticising them because they've been misled, the same as the rest of us have as well. There are signs that this analysis, this understanding of the drug industry is beginning to become the majority view. There was a survey released in February last year, and it found that most people feel the drug industry sees cancer as a money-making opportunity rather than as a disease to eradicate. And the best part about this study was sponsored by Lilly Oncology. Lilly Oncology is a division of the drug company Eli Lilly. And it polled more than 4,000 people in 6 countries. And 60% of the respondents said that they believe drug companies are more interested in treating cancer than curing it. So, you know, I mean, 10, 15 years ago, when Dr. Art and our foundation first started saying these sorts of things, it was pretty shocking. You know, audiences back then were, you know, you guys are sitting there and you get this straight away. It's a sign of how far we've come, really, that all of us understand the dangers to society when we allow multinational corporations to gain such a control over us and our governments. And this is a problem. I mean, globally, if you look at the economic impact of all this, I mean, it's absolutely, totally crazy. The World Economic Forum knows about this because they did a study a few years ago looking at the total global economic impact of just 5 chronic diseases. They looked at cancer, diabetes, mental illness, heart disease, and respiratory disease. And they found that over the next 20 years, the total global economic impact could reach $47 trillion. The total global economic impact of just 5 chronic diseases. I mean, you know, let's face it, there's dozens of them. You know, we can't afford this. I mean, this is insane that we are trying to encourage developing world countries like, you know, in Africa to follow the insane example, you know, with our extraordinary, you know, expensive healthcare system. It's just insane. The economic cost of cancer alone is, we know it's about $1 trillion a year. The cost of heart disease economically to the world is not that far behind that. So, you know, in this age, you know, in the UK and Europe today of austerity, this is a very, very, very great and important time to actually take steps towards dismantling this approach. The European Union is, in Europe, at the heart of all of this. The European Union loves the drug industry. The European Union loves all huge multinational corporate cartel-type industries. And in April 2008, it announced a €2 billion scheme to what it said was to boost drug discovery and establish the EU as what it called the pharmacy of the world. I mean, that phrase was actually used at the press conference when they announced this. And ultimately what they want is to enable drug companies, like in America, to advertise directly to us through the media, in newspapers and magazines and television and the whole range of stuff, you know. But at the same time, of course, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, they are trying to ban non-patentable vitamin therapies, or at least reduce them to near meaningless doses where there's no possible chance of a therapeutic effect, you know. So this is the picture, really. I mean, the second part of my talk, I'll be explaining more about the European Union, how it came about, and how it came that, you know, the multinational corporate cartels have such control over it. And in fact, the thing I'll be focusing most on in the second half are the origins of the EU, which Rob gave a little hint about before. And I promise you that I'll be telling you some things that you've never heard before. But for now, thank you very much. Okay, so I finished up in the first half talking a little bit about this thing they call the European Union. And in this part, the second half of my talk this evening, I'm going to be getting into a bit of politics and a bit of history, but they both relate, as you shall see, to medicine in a rather surprising kind of way. How did our foundation get into this? You know, sometimes we get people coming to us, depending on, you know, what it is they're interested in. But we do get some people coming to us and they say, well, you know, all that history and politics stuff, which I'm going to do next, is all fine. But, you know, you've got to stick to the science. The science is what will change the world. Well, actually, no, you know, for all sorts of reasons. One great reason is that politicians don't read medical journals unless they're doctors. And even if they are, most doctors are too busy. You know, if you've ever been near a doctor's surgery, you know, they're too busy treating patients to read medical journals. They've got no idea, most of them, what's going on, you know, in the latest research. And it's, as I said before, it's not their own fault. So how did we get into what I'm going to say next? Well, what we got into this for was, as we gradually began to realise what we all now know, which is that the European Union is not what we were told it was supposed to be. We started to learn a bit of the stuff that we all, I guess, know a bit about now. But we decided that we wanted to try to verify certain things that kept coming up again and again. And Dr. Rath, being a scientist, of course, he takes a very analytical approach to all of this, and quite rightly so. You know, we're not into conspiracy theories. We're only into, in the science, you know, what we can prove in the studies. And in what I'm going to say to you next, we had to prove this before we eventually, you know, produced a book about it. So what we did, how we began this process over 10 years ago now, we started a pretty exhaustive search of international archives around the world. And we ended up recovering copies of literally tens of thousands of historical documents. And what I have to say next begins with that. This is based upon what we found. The analysis that we now have of this thing, the European Union, you know, was the direct result of that. And the story I'm going to tell you in this half begins in the year 1941, at which point, obviously, the Second World War was 2 years old. And we now know that the Nazi regime was maintaining several official institutes, but with one purpose only. And it was to prepare the future political, economic, and the future economic and political shape of the world for a Nazi and IG Farben victory in World War II. I'll be talking quite a bit more about IG Farben as we get a bit further into this, but for now, all you need to know is that IG Farben was an industrial cartel, a chemical and pharmaceutical cartel. It had financed the rise of the Nazi Party, and as you shall see, it played a very, very important role in the perpetration of World War II. So one of these institutes that the Nazi regime was maintaining was something called the Central Research Institute for National Economic Order and Greater Sphere Economy. And this was based in Dresden, in Germany, and this man here, Arno Scholter, was the man who headed it. And in 1941, Arno Scholter summarised the Nazi IG Farben plans for a post-World War II Europe in a book. And we have a copy of this book in our foundation library. It's in the German language and we have translations on it. But the important thing about this book is that the parallels between the Europe it describes and the European Union we have today are simply astonishing. I'm going to give 3 examples. There are many examples, but I'm going to give 3 examples. The first concept that is described in Scholter's blueprints that you'll recognise is the concept of the European Commission. Now, for any of you who don't know, the European Commission is the unelected executive body of Europe. The laws of Europe start out in the offices of the European Commission. It consists of 28 people, none of whom are elected. No one ever goes anywhere near a ballot box to vote for these people. But they are de facto the 28 most powerful people in Europe. And this concept of an unelected executive body ruling over Europe in this way is described intimately in Scholter's book. But not just that. The system of EU directives is also described in Scholter's book. And in fact, the word directives is actually used. That's the word that's used to describe the system of lawmaking they wanted to bring about in Europe after World War II. Examples, modern day examples of this are the Food Supplements Directive, which is now the law that controls supplements containing vitamins and minerals in Europe today. But the book also talks about something it calls a master agreement. And this was a law, an agreement, a text that was planned to govern any future changes that took place after the implementation of such a system. And this bears an uncanny resemblance, of course, to the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty, which was the treaty that was passed a few years ago, that was intended to govern the future of Europe for thousands of years to come. There's more, though, because one of the sets of documents that we recovered was from the Nuremberg war crimes trials that took place after the end of World War II. There were several trials after World War II that took place in Nuremberg. And the one that got all the attention was the first one. It was the one against the so-called the main war criminals. And after this trial had been completed, and these guys were mostly all hanged and things for their crimes, then there was a series of 12 other trials that took place, and these got, as often is the case with the media, these got a lot less coverage, a lot less focus on these trials. But one of these trials was solely conducted against the managers and directors of this IG Farben cartel that I mentioned a few moments ago. And this man here was a senior director of IG Farben. His name was Fritz Termeer. This is a photograph of him in the dock at Nuremberg. And the interesting thing about Termeer's appearance at Nuremberg was that his legal counsel, a man called Dr. Berndt, specifically stated that the concept of what he called a total European economic area had shaped Termeer's aims, his client's aims. I mean, in a sense, he was sort of trying to make a flimsy defence for Termeer. He was sort of saying, well, yes, my client stands accused here of some terrible crimes, but his aims were honourable. His aims were to bring about the creation of this total European economic area. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Termeer was found guilty of plunder, spoliation, slavery and mass murder. I mean, it's hard to imagine any more serious, more heinous, war crimes. But he was sentenced to only 7 years in prison. And in fact, he was released after serving only 2 years I mean, it's incredible, you know, slavery and mass murder alone have got to be worth, you know, much more. But get this, in 1956, obviously fully aware that the man was a convicted war criminal, a Nazi war criminal, Bayer appointed him as chairman of its supervisory board. Bayer was one of the component companies of IG Farben. Essentially, to all intents and purposes, he got his old job back. And he went on to hold this post for another 8 years. Now, then we move on to Auschwitz, okay? And there's an important link between Auschwitz and Farben. But to get to that, we have to understand something that I think we've all been misled about. And it's this. If you've been to Auschwitz, I've been twice. If you've been to Auschwitz, you'll be very familiar with this. This is the sign over the gate, you know, that greeted every inmate when he or she arrived there. And this states, it says, Arbeit macht frei. I mean, my German is terrible, but what it means is, it means work liberates you. Work frees you. And it's never been adequately explained why that was there. There's been all sorts of bizarre explanations given, you know, but none of them get close to the truth. And the truth is to be found, as I've described, in Nuremberg. So the question is, what does this slogan, work frees you, what does it reveal about the true purpose of Auschwitz at its onset? Well, the Auschwitz concentration camp inmates were used as a source of slave labour by IG Farben. They were used as a source of slave labour at nearby industrial plants, like this one. This plant was IG Auschwitz, and this was a 100% owned subsidiary of IG Farben. The Nuremberg war crimes trial against Farben proved that Farben was responsible for the construction and the operation of this plant, and that it used Auschwitz inmates as a source of slave labour. They were marched up the road, it's a few kilometres up the road, every day and back. It was a huge site. It extended over 6,000 acres, and it was the largest industrial complex in the world at that time. The thing is, right, when you go to Auschwitz, this site, which is still there today, I mean, this is one of my photographs, it's not part of the official tour. You can go to Auschwitz and what they call Auschwitz II, which is Birkenau, another concentration camp. But they will not take you here. It's largely disused now, this site, but it's still there. And it's mentioned in the Nuremberg trial documents. But the most shocking part of the Nuremberg trial documents against Farben relate to the criminal medical experiments. Because you see, we've been told, haven't we, that the medical experiments conducted on concentration camp inmates were sort of conducted by, you know, crazy, insane, perverted Nazis for their, you know, perverted pleasure or something. You know, this is the sort of message that history has given us thus far. Well, you know, if you look at the documents from the Nuremberg war crimes trial, a very different picture begins to emerge. Because in actual fact, criminal medical experiments were conducted on the inmates of Auschwitz using patented pharmaceutical drugs and vaccines from the IG Farben companies. The inmates were used as guinea pigs to be experimented on with experimental drugs and experimental vaccines. And these deadly tests were conducted by Bayer employees, like this man, Helmut Vetter. And get this, the chemicals that were tested on inmates were used to develop the first generation of drugs that eventually became what we now call chemotherapy. So the origins of chemotherapy lie in the tests, the criminal medical tests conducted on the inmates of concentration camps, and they subsequently went on to produce billions of dollars of profit. Do you get an idea now why you haven't been told about this? Why this history has been denied to us? We eventually put all of the Nuremberg documents from the Farben trial online on this website. You can look at them all, and you can download them all for yourself as well as PDFs. We also have, there was a related trial that was called the Doctor's Trial that also has some stuff that relates to this. We've got all that now as well, and you can find it all on this website. We even know what some of these preparations were, some of these chemicals that were used to experiment by these companies on the inmates of Auschwitz. I mean, look at this one, you know. Look at the name at the top. What does it say? Bear. You know, we've all seen awful pictures from Auschwitz. We're all at least dimly aware that experiments took place. But it's not been properly explained to us what was going on there. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there weren't other, you know, awful, bizarre things going on that had nothing to do with this. But this part of the history, I am saying, we haven't been told about. And the proof is there. Go there and read it for yourself. This, when you go to Auschwitz, you know, this is this sign here in 3 languages tells you that this was the building where they conducted these criminal medical experiments. But it doesn't tell you what I'm telling you here. That part yet still is not part of the official story of Auschwitz. And yet the evidence is there, as I say. It's on this website, the original documents you can download. If you go to Auschwitz, as I say, I've been twice now, and if you meet survivors, our foundation has been working with survivors of Auschwitz for over 10 years now. And it's one of the most moving experiences, you know, you could ever have, I guess. Because it will be bad enough just knowing the things and seeing the things that we've been told about Auschwitz. But when you go there, and especially as we know and have talked to survivors, and you gain this understanding, you know, to say it takes your breath away, the extent to which we've been misled, is still not doing it justice, really. But there's more, you see. There's more, because there are things that the European Union doesn't want you to know about even the man who was its first president. This man was Walter Hallstein. He was the first president of the European Commission, and he held that post between 1958 and 1967. You see, before and during World War II, Hallstein was a member of official Nazi organisations. The Association of National Socialist German Lawyers was founded in 1933, just after the Nazis had seized power. But in 1936, this organisation was converted to the notorious Nazi Association of Law Protectors, and membership of this organisation was restricted to those lawyers. Hallstein was a lawyer, by the way. Restricted to those lawyers who showed uncompromising support and participation in Nazi ideology. And Hallstein was a member of both of these organisations. How do we know that? Well, we know that because we have a copy of a memorandum sent by Hallstein to the representative of the Nazi government at the University of Rostock in Germany in 1935. So we have it in his own words that he was a member of these two organisations. But there's more. The thing that tells us the most about Hallstein and his ideology is a speech he gave shortly before the outbreak of World War II. He gave this speech in Rostock, at this building here, which is still a landmark today. This building is still there in Rostock. But the content of this speech, which I'm going to briefly summarise next, I promise you will change your ideas about the European Union forever. A key aspect of this speech was what Hallstein described as the link-up, a very disingenuous phrase, the link-up of Austria with large parts of what used to be known as Czechoslovakia and Germany. And Hallstein described the seizing of these countries as being, and I quote, part of the creation of the Greater German Reich and the legal Germanization of the new territories. So Hallstein was using legal language to say that Germany had a legal right to expand or to link up with those countries. And get this, he specifically stated that the failure to create what he described as a unified legal system for Greater Germany, as he described it, was one of the unfinished tasks and failures of the Second German Reich. The Second German Reich covered that period through the end of the 19th century up to the end of the First World War. So what he was saying was that the failure of Germany, as you know, at the end of World War II, to create a unified legal system for the area that it was trying to take over and control, or link up with, in his language, this was one of the greatest unfinished tasks and failures of the Second German Reich. But there's more. Because he described the legal process, the intended legal process for the creation of this unified legal system as being the issuing of directives. There's that word again, directives. So this was 1939. 2 years later, Arno Scholter included the same system, that same word in his book. Remember I showed you that just before. But get this, he also described the creation of the Greater German Reich as being an economic event. An economic event, he said, of sheer, unimaginable consequences. So to Hallstein, the creation of this Greater German Reich was a legal thing, but it was an economic thing, which was essentially what Fritz Tamir's lawyer, Dr. Berndt, said at Nuremberg. But the most shocking thing of all that Hallstein described in this speech was when he stated that one of the most important laws to be introduced in the annexed, the invaded countries, was the law for the protection of the German blood and the German honour. In other words, he advocated the introduction, the imposition, in fact, of the Nuremberg racial laws on the annexed countries. Now, these laws, of course, were the laws that excluded German Jews from Reich citizenship. They prohibited the German Jews from marrying or even having sexual relations with Germans or people of German-related blood. So when we say in our book that Hallstein was a racist and a fascist, these are why we say these things. This was the ideology of this man. How do we know he said these things? Well, we have a copy of the entire manuscript, his handwritten manuscript for this speech, containing the title and every word that he spoke. But that's not all. We have a copy of a newspaper article published the following day, confirming the venue of the speech, the dates of the speech also. And it describes how the attendees at this speech included the entire elite of the Nazi state in that region, Rostock. We also have a copy of the official invitation to the event, confirming the title of the speech, the date of the speech, the venue of the speech. So we have multiple evidence that Hallstein gave this speech and said these things. This was the ideology of the first president of the European Commission. One of the founding, if not the founding father of the European Union, who is celebrated today for that. So we have to ask ourselves at this point, how did a man like this come to sign the Treaties of Rome? The Treaties of Rome were signed in 1957, and these were the documents that gave birth to the European Union as we now know it today. How could a man with that ideology come to be sitting there with his pen poised to change the future of Europe with one stroke of his pen? I mean, I put it to you, that the logical conclusion is that this could only happen if the people, or rather the companies who would most benefit from it, wanted it to be so. There is no other conclusion. It is unthinkable that Hallstein could possibly be sitting there only 12 years after the end of World War II, having participated in Nazi organisations and having the ideology that he had. It's unthinkable that nobody could possibly be aware of that. But there's more, you see, because it turns out that the cartel, the companies of IG Farben, were the economic driving force behind both world wars, not just World War II. This plan is older than any of us have been led to believe. During World War I, the companies that came to make up IG Farben already controlled over 1,000 patents. And this was the largest number of patents controlled by any corporate group at that time. Some examples, and some pretty shocking examples of that. In 1910, 4 years before the outbreak of World War I, BASF, the chemical company, took out a patent on the technology that enabled the making of bombs from air, bombs from nitrogen. This was the man who invented this. It involved the use of the nitrogen molecule. So 4 years before World War I took place, Germany already had technology to produce bombs from air. And this was provided for them by BASF. The other, of course, feature in World War I, was the fact that this was the first war in which chemical warfare agents were introduced. And these were, to all intents and purposes, the first weapons of mass destruction used in a war. Well, the patent owners of mustard gas and other chemical warfare agents were Bayer. Here's a really interesting thing. 6 weeks after the outbreak of World War I, the Chancellor of Germany's office produced its war goals, its war aims. And this was something it called the September Programme. Listen to this. It said, our goal is to enforce a Central European Economic Union. That phrase again. With joint custom regulations that includes France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Austria-Hungary, Poland, and potentially Italy, Sweden, and Norway. This union, it said, under German leadership, has to stabilise the economic dominance of Germany over Central Europe. And this was September 1914. You see, this plan for a European Union, a European economic union with Germany at its centre, is a century old. So the EU, or the Brussels EU, as we refer to it in our book, is actually the third attempt by multinational cartel at world takeover. Then as now, they have no intention of stopping at the dominance of Europe, at the control of Europe under this system. In fact, the blueprint, the EU blueprint, is already being copied and exported to other parts of the world. The African Union, for example, already has an African Union Commission. The African Union Commissioners, of course, are unelected. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which describes itself as an economic trade group, has already stated its intention to use aspects of the European model in its future development. The European Union is the model, and the European Union is actively encouraging and assisting these regions in following along this same plan. So what can we do? This is the question, this is the key question. And, you know, as we sit here in Britain today, We're already aware that a great many people already know enough about this construct, this Brussels EU construct, that they've heard enough and they want to leave. We know this. If we're lucky, we might get a referendum on it here. But I wouldn't hold your breath, because the people who most benefit from this will stop at almost nothing to ensure that we don't get a vote. I'm sure most of us already understand this. But the first step in affecting positive change in any of the areas I've been talking about tonight, the area of health, bringing truth to politics and history, the first step is to realise that we've been misled many times in the past. Some people never manage to take that step, and in the area of health, the inability to accept the fact that your doctor might be wrong can cost you your life. I mean, we all know this. I'm going to talk a little bit in a few moments about this concept we call health illiteracy. I talked with one or two of you about it in the interval. But taking that step to understand that we are actively being misled in so many areas of our lives is the most important thing that we can do. It's about bringing about a change in our thinking. And for those people who are not able to do that, for those people who say, well, yes, if this was true, I would certainly by now have been reading about it in my newspaper. Well, not yet. And if you intend to wait until your doctor offers these therapies, or rather the national health services around Europe and the world offer these therapies I was talking about earlier to you, you may wait a very, very long time. In fact, you may die first before this happens, unless we collectively do something about it. I mentioned earlier that our foundation has done quite a bit of work with survivors of Auschwitz, and I said before, and I repeat again, these are amongst the most remarkable people you could ever hope to meet. I mean, I guess you'd have to be. To survive something like that, you would have to be made up of some pretty remarkable character attributes. And we've had several meetings and conferences that we've held and attended with these people. And in 2007, they proposed something that they called a Europe for the people, by the people. And this is essentially sort of a framework constitution for Europe, if you like, but it puts as its foremost goals the rights to health, the rights to life, the rights to natural healthy food, to clean water, a safe environment, putting people before profit, putting people before multinational corporations, because these people have seen the very, very worst that multinational corporations are capable of. And they can already, if you talk to them, they will tell you they can already see some of the same mistakes that were made back then being repeated again today. So you can sign this petition, because that's what it is. But it fulfills a goal, because in signing this and telling other people about it, you are in the process educating other people about this. And what this is about, I mean, this petition lives on this website of ours. I thought you might like that. Our EU referendum website. Because you see, we're led to believe that we live in a democracy, and wars are being conducted now, with the goal of bringing democracy to the rest of the world at the barrel of a gun. Well, as Mark Twain famously said, if voting, and by that he meant the system that we have, because it's been in for a long time, if voting made any difference, they wouldn't let us do it. Getting one vote, right, getting one vote every 4 or 5 years is not democracy, it's an illusion. We don't control anything. In Switzerland, they have a system which is not perfect, but it's better, whereby when the government produces a law, the citizens have a certain time period within which, if they can get a sufficient number of signatures, they can challenge that law and force the government back to the drawing board. And the reverse is true in Switzerland as well. People, if they get enough signatures, they can propose a law and force the Swiss government to consider it. It's not perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than what we have right now, whether you're talking about the national level or the European level. And that's why Mark Twain said this, you see. We're living under this illusion that our one vote changes stuff. It doesn't. In fact, as everyone recognises, the three main parties here in Britain are increasingly alike. They're becoming increasingly indistinguishable from each other. And they all support the Brussels EU. Well, how about that? That's choice for you. That's democracy. We met with some of these survivors last year, in fact. And as you can see, there's not as many of them left now. In not too many years, there'll be none of them left. So one of the things we did last year, we actually filmed some interviews with them. The interviews are all in Polish, and at the moment, the only version we have available on our YouTube channel is in Polish. But what we're planning to do is to do English subtitles under these interviews. The film's about 20 minutes long, and we're going to do this, to be honest, we're going to do it subtitled in as many languages as we can. Because, you know, you can see by their ages that they're not going to be around forever. The ones that are alive now, pretty much, are the ones that were in Auschwitz and Birkenau as children or teenagers. But they're remarkable people. And what they are calling for now are for these principles in the constitution framework I described to you earlier, the Europe for the people, by the people. They're wanting to propel this to the global level. They're saying essentially that unless the world can be reorganised along proper democratic lines, the multinational corporate cartels that are seeking control over our lives will do whatever they have to do to achieve their aims. So this is one of the things that our Movement of Life project, which some of you may know about, is all about. We have a website, because to us, the bottom line here, which I'm sure the fact that you guys come here, you know, as often as you do, you know that it's about education. It's about each of us teaching each one of us. And we've essentially identified 6 areas that are the most important areas to these multinational corporate cartels. The area of health I've talked a lot about. I've got nothing really I can usefully add in the short time available tonight. The area of food, well, you know, we all know about genetically modified foods. And the fact is, you know, that Monsanto and these companies are interested in GM seeds because they can be patented. You can't patent, you know, an organic potato. You know, you cannot patent a naturally occurring potato. But if you can modify the molecules in the seed into a configuration that doesn't exist in nature, you can patent it. And that's why Monsanto and these companies are doing this. They want to own the food supply. So it's the same business model as the pharma industry. And of course, not, you know, incoincidentally, some of the same companies that are involved in producing pharmaceuticals and chemicals are also involved in the GM industry. And the reason is it's the same model. It's the same patent model they're using. The area of water, well, our water supply already contains measurable amounts of pharmaceuticals. When you turn on your tap and, you know, fill your glass, your teapot, whatever, with water, there are measurable amounts of pharmaceuticals now turning up in the water supply all over the world. And of course the reason for that is simple, because people are consuming them. You know, the residues get passed out in the urine, into the toilet, you know, flushed back through, and the water companies haven't got the technology, they're not implementing technology to filter this stuff out. All they do is basic cleansing and cleaning. So whether we like it or not, we're all consuming, you know, levels of pharmaceuticals of one sort or another. And then of course energy. I'm sure you must have had people coming here talking to you about alternative sources of energy. And you know, why are we still fixated and dependent upon oil? Well, I'll tell you what the key reason is, and it's one that people haven't really cottoned onto yet, is have you ever thought who's the biggest beneficiary of globalization? Well, I mean, it's the oil industry, because everything that's transported to be sold across borders and that has to be transported in vehicles. which involves oil, petrol, fuel. So every good that is transported, as part of what we now call globalization, the price includes a component for the transport. And the oil industry, of course, being the supplier of fuel for transport, benefits from this hugely. The oil industry is the biggest beneficiary from globalization. Knowledge is the fifth area, and of course, everything falls into this category. Knowledge includes education. We have, here in Britain, we're lucky to have, compared to many areas of the world that I've seen, a really decent educational system. And at least until you go to university, it's free. But, of course, as we now know, to give the example I've focused on most tonight, our doctors are not being taught about the basic principles, the crucial relationships between nutrition, health and disease. So, in so many areas, even our most eminent people are being lied to or misled or not given the entire understanding of what it is that they're going to be practicing. I've talked to medical students in several countries, and they will tell you, if you meet them yourselves, ask them, do they learn about nutrition in medical school? And the vast majority of the world gets little or no tuition in medical school relating to nutrition.
Get half a day.
It varies across countries, but the point is that this cannot be by accident. If you look at the amount of knowledge that now exists in the area of nutrition, it cannot possibly be that they've just forgotten to implement this. In fact, if you talk to students, they'll tell you that they get the impression that it's almost not important, nutrition. It's not real medicine, And then finally, work. Employment. Have you ever thought about the fact that employment and unemployment are just different ways of making money? You see, if a large corporation thinks it can make more money from employing more people, that's what it does. But at any point, if it decides it can make more money by making people unemployed, that's what it does. Employment and unemployment are just opposite sides of the same coin. They're just other ways, opposite ways of making money. Health literacy. You see, the stuff that I'm telling you tonight, either I'm crazy and it's all wrong, or we've all been misled. I'd like to assume that we've all decided that there's something that we're missing out on here tonight and that we've been misled and not told about this. But health illiteracy is a different type of illiteracy to the definition of the word that we've all grown up with. You see, if you go back to the invention of the printing press was invented over 550 years ago in Germany. And within only a few decades, the printing of books was taking place in hundreds of cities all over Europe. But you know what? If you look at the statistics, even today, there are around 880 million people on the planet. That's about 12.3% of the global population who can't read or write. That's about 1 in 8 people on the planet can't read or write. Now, what that tells you is that even after the invention of technology that enabled the mass printing of books and the process of reading and writing accelerated dramatically after that took place, even 550 years later, 1 in 8 people hasn't yet benefited from that for one reason or another. So new inventions can sometimes take a long time to reach the masses, to reach all of us. And then there's the internet. I mean, living in Britain, living in Europe, living in the Western world, we get the impression that the internet is a global thing. In fact, we call it, don't we, the World Wide Web. Well, it's not. In fact, the latest figures that I could find related to June 2012, and the most reliable figures these, and in June 2012 it was estimated that about 2.4 billion people had access to the internet. That's about 34%. That means that 2 out of every 3 people on the planet haven't yet got access to the internet. And that's before you even get into the fact that if you talk to people in Africa, you'll find that the internet speeds, and reliability of the internet there is nothing like what we have here for most countries. So, whilst the invention of the internet, I've no doubt, will prove to be a watershed event in the education and the freeing of mankind, the fact is that majority of people, 66%, don't yet have access to it. 66% of the people on the planet haven't yet had the opportunity to expand their minds, to open themselves up to alternatives like we've been talking about here tonight. And what does that have to do with health literacy? Well, because compared to regular literacy and the lack of an internet connection, health literacy is far more widespread. The vast majority of people on the planet do not have any idea about the close and crucial relationships between nutrition, health and disease. And as I've been saying many times tonight, this includes our doctors. And the reason for that is obvious. I talked about it earlier. It's that this information is essentially controlled by special interests who consider it forbidden knowledge. Because the widespread sharing of this information threatens everything for them. Absolutely everything. We have something, talking about health education and liberation from health literacy, we have something called our Body XQ project, and we spent a lot of money and a lot of time on this, and I can assure you there is no interactive graphic on the internet anywhere like this. It's at bodyxq.org. And what it does, it enables you to simulate in an incredibly lifelike way the workings of the heart, and alter parameters like sort of blood pressure and things and respiration, and also, optimum nutrition and, poor nutrition, and see how these affect the workings of the heart. You can cut away the heart and watch its internal workings while you alter these parameters. And you can even zoom in right down to the cellular level. It's a fantastic educational tool, especially for children, of course. We have another graphic that deals with cancer. And you can watch the development of cancer, you can watch the processes I talked about earlier in the section of my talk on cancer. Health education is the answer. And literally, the more people that can understand this, the more people who can learn about the things I've been talking about tonight, it's possible literally to save millions of lives. But those lives can only be saved if this information is shared. The bottom line for us is that the only way to bring a change to the healthcare systems of the world is if the people of the world together demand it. And we're not yet at the crucial tipping point whereby, change will occur. We're still at the education stage, and this is why I come round and with my colleagues and Dr. Rath do similar things to show people, tell people about what's available and how they've been misled. If we didn't believe it was possible to change these things, we wouldn't be doing this. We believe that a better future is possible. A better future is possible for not just Britain, but also for Europe and the world. But to get there, it depends on all of us playing their part. That's all I have to say for tonight. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Yeah, I mean...
He got struck off, and then his son became the President of America, then his other son became the President of America. The whole system's just, corrupt and flawed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the history of what led up to the Second World War and what took place during it that involves, all sorts of interest groups and politicians. And certainly, in many cases, this information has either been not given to us or we've been misled, and I'm sure there's an awful lot more yet that we still don't know. But for sure, I think approach it with an open mind and look for the evidence.
Well, there's one more, sorry, can I say one more?
Yeah.
Merck was allegedly set up by Hitler's top scientists. He was released from prison early by the Rockefellers and brought over to America. And Merck was created our vaccine company, for God's sake, But these people, if they get found out, they will not go to prison. So basically, the truth, in my opinion, is coming out, hence why we've got all these wars going on all over the world. Because the truth cannot come out. How can the truth come out about all this?
Well, that's right. I mean, this is sort of...
Years and years and years.
That's right. That's right. So in a sense, you know, you could argue that, you know, what my colleagues and I are doing by producing that book is, you know, you could argue if you want that we're helping them, because they're never going to admit it themselves. They're never going to tell you themselves. They've painted themselves into such a corner now that they cannot possibly get out. And so it really is literally up to us, because if we don't tell people, who's going to do it? As you say, they're not going to do it. The gentleman over here put his hand up in the middle of the talk, so let's, you next, sir.
Yeah, going back to Fritz Tameria, I think it was him, according to my research, who came up with our Vitamap for the gates of that.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that. If true, it wouldn't surprise me, but I mean, again, you know, it's...
The link with the oil cartels, IG Farben became equal shareholders in Rockefeller
Standard Oil.
And it was Nelson Rockefeller who got Fritz Tameria out of prison earlier, so
I didn't know that.
he interviewed US Vice President eventually.
Who's next?
IG Farben who actually manufactured the gas chambers.
Yes, it was an IG Farben company that produced the pellets, that's right, that were Zyklon B that exterminated, that produced the gas for Auschwitz, that's right. Yeah.
I do have another point to make, and would account for the lack of any nutritional education in medical schools, is that I believe 85% of the funding for medical school is provided by Big Pharma.
Of course.
Yeah, so
They have a vested interest in this system continuing. The lady behind in the yellow, I think, put her hand up. Well, I mean, you know, if you think about it, the system of medicine that we have is encouraging us to believe that, you know, the only answers to disease are synthetic, artificially created molecules, and that there's nothing in the natural world that could possibly be of help. I mean, that's pretty much the picture, isn't it? I mean, again, you know, I used the word several times, I'll use it one more time. I mean, that's insane. It's not logical, it's not rational, you know. The gentleman at the back there.
Does taking vitamin C contribute to the alkalinity acidity?
I don't know. We hear a lot about this alkalinity, sort of acidity issue. The only part that concerns us really is restoring the nutritional status, you know, an optimum nutritional status. If that in the process results in, you know, a higher, you know, optimum alkalinity, well, great. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if it does, but it's not, you know, if it's true that cancer patients have a, you know, a higher acidity, well, it's not the acidity itself that's the problem, but it's what's causing that, and that's the poor nutritional status, obviously, according to, you know, what our researchers are finding. Anybody else? The man next to you.
Can you tell us something about the blood pressure, how dangerous it is?
Yeah.